The courthouse smelled like old wood and desperation. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame after 3 months in county jail awaiting trial. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the wooden table, watching the prosecution present what they claimed was ironclad evidence. A German Shepherd police dog named Baron, handler Officer David Kessler beside him, both prepared to testify that Baron had tracked Marcus's scent from the crime scene, a liquor store robbery that left the owner with a fractured skull. Marcus hadn't slept properly in 92 days. He knew this because he'd counted them. Every single night in the county detention facility, lying on a thin plastic mattress in a cell that smelled like industrial bleach and human despair, he'd counted the days. 92. Each one felt like a year. Each one carved something away from who he used to be. The suit he wore was from his trial preparation wardrobe, purchased 4 months ago when he was still the man his neighbors knew. The man who worked at the automotive plant, who brought his daughter to school every morning, who paid his taxes and called his mother on Sundays. That man felt like a ghost now, a memory of someone who'd existed in a different lifetime. The suit fit differently now because he'd lost 23 pounds in jail. Stress and bad food had a way of hollowing you out. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick. Alina had noticed when he touched her hand during the first day of trial. She'd squeezed gently, careful not to hurt him, but he could feel her fear transmitted through that simple contact. Fear for him, fear for their future, fear that the system she'd been taught to trust might actually destroy them both. The gallery was packed, not with supporters. Marcus didn't have many people left in his corner. Mostly it was court reporters, legal observers, and random people who came to courtrooms the way others went to movie theaters, seeking drama, seeking to witness human tragedy in person. There was something voyeuristic about it, the way they leaned forward in their seats, not wanting to miss a single moment of someone's potential destruction. But Alina was there, directly behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence like a warm fire in a cold room. And next to her, coloring on a yellow notepad with a box of crayons they'd brought from home, was their daughter, Sophia, 4 years old, born on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks early, when Marcus was working a double shift and had to break 15 speed limits getting to the hospital. She'd come into the world with her eyes wide open, looking around like she was trying to memorize everything about this new place. The nurses had commented on how alert she was, how unusually present. They didn't know that this was just who Sophia was, a child who noticed things. A child who observed the world with the kind of attention most adults lost before they turned 7. She was wearing the pink dress Alina had bought her for court. "We want the judge to see what a good girl she is," Alina had whispered the night before trial, as if a 4-year-old's outfit could counterbalance the weight of evidence, corruption, and the machinery of the criminal justice system bearing down on them. But Marcus hadn't argued. He'd smiled, kissed Alina's forehead, and pretended to believe that appearance might matter. Sophia didn't understand what was happening. Alina had tried to explain it in terms a child could grasp. Daddy has to talk to some people in a big building. It's like when you had to talk to the principal about the accident with the paint. But how do you explain wrongful accusation to a 4-year-old? How do you make them understand that the system designed to protect them might actually destroy them? Marcus hadn't seen his daughter in person since his arrest. Visits to the jail were limited, and Alina had mostly kept Sophia away, wanting to protect her from the reality of what incarceration looked like. There were no photos to hang on a prison cell wall. Marcus had requested to stay isolated from the other inmates, knowing that a man who maintained any kind of innocence claim was a target in general population. So he'd been alone, in a cell alone, eating meals alone, exercising in the yard during times when no one else was permitted to be there, completely, utterly alone. The sight of Sophia now, just 15 feet away, nearly broke him. She was concentrating on her coloring with the kind of serious focus only young children could muster. Her small tongue peeked out slightly between her lips as she worked, a mannerism she'd inherited from Alina. She was trying to stay inside the lines of a drawing that appeared to be a castle. Pink towers, purple flags, absolutely perfect in her 4-year-old way. She was also completely unaware that her father's entire life was being dismantled in real time, right in front of them both. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Holloway, stood with the kind of confidence that came from a 90% conviction rate. She was good at her job, too good. She'd won so many cases that she probably didn't even question them anymore. She just believed in the system, believed in the evidence, believed in the inherent competence of law enforcement. The system had never failed her, so why would she doubt it? "Baron," Holloway began, gesturing toward the German shepherd with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy objects, "is one of the most highly trained and reliable scent-tracking dogs in the state. His handler, Officer Kessler, has undergone extensive certification. Baron has been involved in 17 criminal apprehensions. His accuracy rate exceeds 98%. The courtroom hung on her every word. This was the centerpiece of their case, the thing that would send Marcus to prison. Not a witness who'd seen him commit the robbery, not surveillance footage, not physical evidence found on his person or in his home. The entire case rested on a dog whose nose supposedly never lied. Judge Patricia Morrison, sitting elevated above them all on her bench, made notes in her leather-bound journal. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back severely, and the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and every tragedy the criminal justice system had to offer. She'd probably stopped being surprised by humans a decade ago. She certainly didn't look surprised now. Tom Richardson, Marcus's public defender, was competent but exhausted. You could see it in the way he sat, the slight slump to his shoulders, the mechanical nature of his note-taking. He was handling 47 cases simultaneously in an underfunded public defender's office. 47 lives hanging in the balance, and he was one man with limited resources, limited time, and an unlimited caseload. Marcus had asked him once during a consultation, "Do you think we can win?" Tom had been honest. Scent evidence is powerful in court. Juries love it. It feels scientific. It feels objective. But your financial records check out. You were nowhere near the liquor store when it happened. You were clocking out of work 10 miles away. We've got security footage from the plant showing you leaving at 7:41. The robbery wasn't until 7:45. Even if you'd been speeding, even if you'd broken every traffic law, you couldn't have made it. "So that should mean something," Marcus had said. "It should," Tom had agreed. "But a dog's testimony. Juries believe dogs more than they believe forensic timelines. There's something about animal instinct that people find more trustworthy than human logic." Now, as Holloway continued her presentation, outlining Baron's credentials and training, Marcus felt something collapse inside his chest. A feeling like his organs were shutting down one by one, his heart still beating but everything else folding in on itself. This was it. This was the moment his life ended. 20 years from now, he would be 46 years old, looking at a wall of a prison cell, unable to remember what his daughter's laugh sounded like. Sophia would be 24, and she might not even remember her father except as a ghost from her early childhood, a man who'd been erased from her life by the machinery of justice. Alina would have to divorce him. It was the only way to protect herself financially, to protect Sophia from being labeled as the daughter of a felon. Tom had already warned him about this. "It might be something she needs to do," he'd said carefully. "For the stability of your daughter, you understand." Marcus understood. He understood everything. He understood that he was innocent, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the system was going to destroy him anyway, because that's what the system did to people like him. Men without money, without resources, without a defense team that could afford expert witnesses to discredit police dogs. As Officer Kessler led Baron down the center aisle toward the witness box, the dog's nails clicking against the marble floor with a sound like a clock counting down, Marcus felt something inside him give way. Not his body, something deeper. His spirit, maybe. His belief in justice. His faith that innocence might matter in a system ostensibly designed to protect it. Baron was a beautiful dog. German shepherds were imposing animals, bred for work, for loyalty, for the kind of obedience that human beings could only dream of achieving. Baron had probably never disobeyed a command in his life. He probably would follow Officer Kessler off a cliff if ordered to do so. There was something both noble and tragic about that kind of absolute trust. The dog's handler led him forward with professional confidence. This was routine for them. Just another day at work. Just another case. Just another innocent man about to be convicted based on the infallible testimony of a German shepherd. And then something shifted. Sophia, bored with her coloring, suddenly stood up on her chair. The movement was sudden, unexpected, the kind of thing a 4-year-old does without thinking about consequences or appropriateness. She pointed at Baron with her small hand, her voice cutting through the courtroom silence like a blade. "Mama, that's the doggy that was at the park." The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the child. Judge Morrison's gavel paused in her hand. And Officer Kessler's face went white, the color of a man watching his entire world collapse in the span of a single heartbeat. His jaw clenched. His hand, still holding Baron's leash, began to tremble visibly. Because in that moment, with those 8 simple words from a child, everything changed. Marcus felt it immediately. Felt it in the sudden shift of the room's energy, in the way the judge's expression transformed from boredom to sharp attention, in the way the prosecutor's confidence cracked like thin ice beneath a heavy weight. A 4-year-old girl had just said something that wasn't supposed to be said. And there was absolutely no way to unsay it. The courtroom held its breath, and in that suspended moment between what was and what would come next, Marcus allowed himself to hope for the first time in 92 days. "Objection, relevance," Prosecutor Holloway snapped, but her voice had lost its steel. There was panic underneath it now, a tremor that hadn't been there moments before. She'd built her entire case on the foundation of Baron's infallibility, and a 4-year-old girl had just pulled the first brick loose. Judge Morrison raised her hand slowly, her expression unreadable but her eyes suddenly alive with something that might have been recognition. She'd been on the bench long enough to understand that sometimes the most important moments in a trial came when you least expected them. "Approach the bench, both of you. Now," the judge said, her voice cutting through the electricity that now filled the courtroom. As Tom Richardson and Janet Holloway moved toward the judge's elevated bench, Alina quickly reached over and pulled Sophia back into her seat, her own heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through bone. She hadn't expected her daughter to speak. Sophia had been instructed to sit quietly, to be a good girl, to understand that Daddy's big day required her best behavior. But children don't operate on the logic of legal strategy. Children operate on their own timing, their own understanding of the world, their own mysterious instincts about when something important needs to be said. "What did you mean, sweetheart?" Alina whispered urgently, bending down to her daughter's ear. "About the park, what doggy?" Sophia turned to look at her mother, her small face serious in the way only young children could be serious, completely present, completely honest, without any of the filters that adults had learned to apply to their observations. "The doggy was there, with the bad man," Sophia said matter-of-factly, already returning her attention to her coloring, her mind already moving on to the more important work of staying inside the lines of her castle drawing. "The man who yelled at me." Alina's blood turned to ice water. A man who yelled at her, a man with a dog, a man at the park. She tried to press further, but Sophia was already done with the conversation, her 4-year-old attention span having moved firmly back to the task of making her drawing perfect. Alina sat back in her chair, her mind racing, trying to understand what her daughter had just said and what it might mean. In the judge's chamber, behind closed doors where the record wasn't being kept, and the gallery couldn't hear, the conversation was growing heated. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over courtrooms for 32 years, had fixed her eyes on Officer Kessler. She had a simple question, and she asked it with the kind of directness that comes from decades of reading guilty consciences and sorting truth from convenient lies. "Officer Kessler," she said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "was your dog ever at Riverside Park? Within the last 6 months?" The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche, when everyone in the snow field knows something is about to give way. Kessler's jaw clenched visibly. His eyes darted between the judge and Holloway, who was staring at him with an expression that was rapidly shifting from confidence to something approximating horror. She was realizing in real time that something might be wrong with her case, something fundamental. "Your Honor, with respect," Kessler began, his voice strained. "Answer the question," Judge Morrison interrupted, her tone brooking no negotiation. The silence stretched for another eternal moment. "Yes," Kessler finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Barron was trained there. We practiced scent tracking exercises with volunteer suspects on Tuesday mornings, from April through July." The room seemed to shift on its axis. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Kessler's face. She'd been doing this long enough to know when she was looking at the truth, and the truth looked like a man whose career was imploding in real time. "And the defendant," she asked quietly, "was Marcus Webb ever one of those volunteers?" Another suffocating silence filled the judge's private chamber. Kessler's hands, which had been gripping the back of a chair, suddenly relaxed. He looked down at his shoes, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of authority. I don't recall," he said, but they all knew it was a lie. They could all hear it in the way the words fell flat, in the way his shoulders had surrendered. Tom Richardson felt the floor shift beneath his feet. In all his years of public defense work, years of fighting battles he had no resources to win, years of accepting impossible odds and doing his best anyway, he'd learned to recognize the moment when everything changed. This was that moment. Something had just cracked open, and they could all see the light coming through. Holloway's face had gone pale. She was staring at Kessler with an expression that mingled betrayal with dawning horror. She trusted him. The entire police department had presented Barron's scent-tracking abilities as gospel truth, and she'd believed it. She'd staked her reputation, her conviction record, the credibility of her entire office on this evidence. And now it was falling apart because of something a child had said. "I need to review the training records," Judge Morrison said quietly. "And I need them immediately, all of them. Every volunteer who participated in scent-tracking exercises with Barron since January. I want names, dates, and signatures, and I want to know exactly what those exercises entailed." Back in the courtroom, when they returned from the judge's chamber, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The confident energy that had filled the prosecution side of the room had evaporated. In its place was something electric and uncertain. Judge Morrison called for a recess, her voice formal but with an undercurrent of something else. Perhaps urgency, perhaps righteous anger at the thought that justice might have been perverted in her courtroom. "We're adjourning for the rest of the day," she announced to the gallery. "The defendant remains in custody pending further investigation into evidence presented by the police department. Court will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. The gavel came down with a sound like a judge's executioner's axe, the sound of finality, the sound of something ending and something else beginning. Tom Richardson immediately grabbed Marcus's arm. "Don't say anything. Don't react. Just look relieved but not too relieved. We're going to get you out of here, but we can't celebrate anything yet. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, barely hearing the words. His eyes were fixed on Alina, who'd gathered Sophia in her arms. His daughter was waving at him, still not understanding the significance of what she'd done, still just a little girl who'd noticed something about a dog. But that small observation had changed everything. As the bailiffs began processing the crowd toward the exits, Alina managed to catch Marcus's eye for just a moment. She mouthed something, not words, but a feeling transmitted silently across the space between them. "We might be okay." In the hallway outside the courtroom, as reporters began gathering and phones started buzzing with the news, Tom Richardson was already on his phone with a forensic expert, a voice analyst, and a paralegal who specialized in chain-of-custody issues. "Pull everything," he was saying urgently. "Any case where Barron has been used as evidence in the last 5 years. I need it all. Something's wrong with that dog's training or handling, and we need to find out what before tomorrow." Meanwhile, in a nearby office, Judge Morrison was meeting with her law clerk, a sharp young woman named Rebecca who'd been with her for 3 years, and had the kind of institutional memory that proved invaluable in situations like this. "What are the implications if the sent evidence is contaminated?" the judge asked. "Complete dismissal of the case," Rebecca said quietly. "But more than that, it calls into question every case where Barron has been used, every conviction, every plea deal that was influenced by Barron's testimony." Judge Morrison closed her eyes. The magnitude of what was beginning to unfold was staggering. If one police dog's evidence was corrupted, how many innocent people might be in prison? How many guilty people might have walked free because the system was broken in ways nobody had bothered to investigate? She thought about the child who'd made the observation, a 4-year-old girl who'd noticed something, remembered it, and had the innocence to speak it aloud in a moment when speaking it mattered. It was the kind of moment that restored your faith in the system, even as that same system was beginning to reveal its deepest flaws. In the parking garage beneath the courthouse, Officer Kessler sat in his patrol car with both hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. His phone had already buzzed 7 times. Captain Harrison, the chief, the assistant DA's office. Everyone wanted to know what was happening, what was going wrong, what he'd said in that chamber. But Kessler couldn't bring himself to call anyone back yet. He sat in the darkness of the garage, the weight of what he'd admitted beginning to settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. He'd made a mistake, a small one, a volunteer training exercise at Riverside Park. He'd taken Barron there because it was a good open space, a good place to practice scent tracking. He'd brought volunteers, people who'd signed waivers, people who were happy to participate in police training exercises for $100 cash. And Marcus Webb had been one of them. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Just a random connection that had nothing to do with the robbery, nothing to do with Barron correctly identifying Marcus's scent at the crime scene. But as Kessler sat in the darkness, he knew he was lying to himself. He knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from understanding your own complicity, that something was very wrong. And as he reached for his phone to make the first of what would be many damning calls, he also understood that his life, the one he'd built, the one he'd been so careful to protect, was about to end. The recess didn't last 30 minutes. What the judge's clerk discovered in the training records made even the seasoned bailiff's hands shake as he photocopied pages at double speed. The mechanical sound of the machine filling the cramped evidence room with a rhythm that felt almost like a countdown clock. Judge Morrison sat at her desk with the files spread before her like an autopsy in progress, dissecting a case that was supposed to be simple and clean, but was revealing itself to be infected with something dark. Rebecca, her law clerk, stood beside her with the particular expression of someone who was watching her entire understanding of how the system worked collapse in real time. "Every Tuesday morning," Rebecca was saying, reading from the volunteer sign-in logs with a voice that had grown quieter with each new revelation. "For 7 months. April, May, June, July. Different volunteers. They signed waivers. They were paid $100 each. Judge Morrison's fingers traced down the list of names. Marcus Webb, April 17th, April 24th, May 1st, May 8th, May 15th. 5 times. Marcus had volunteered 5 times to participate in Barron's scent tracking exercises. 3 months later, the robbery happened. The scent evidence that supposedly proved Marcus's guilt, the physical evidence that connected him to the crime scene, could have come from those training sessions. Barron's nose didn't know the difference between a man's scent from a controlled training exercise and that same man's scent at a crime scene. The dog had likely just recognized a familiar smell and alerted accordingly. It was called scent contamination. It was a known problem in police K-9 units, but most departments had protocols to prevent it. Most police officers wouldn't conduct training exercises with the same volunteers at the same locations where future crimes might occur. Unless it was intentional. Unless someone wanted that contamination to happen. "Pull everything," Judge Morrison said quietly to Rebecca. "I want the complete chain of custody documentation for Barron's evidence in the Webb case. I want to know every place that dog went between the training exercises at Riverside Park and the actual crime scene investigation. I want to know who handled the evidence, who documented it, who signed off on it." Rebecca nodded and left, her footsteps echoing down the courthouse hallway like the countdown of a bomb nobody could disarm. Meanwhile, in a court-appointed investigator's office across town, a man named Vincent Chen was having his own realization. Vincent had been assigned to the Webb case because Tom Richardson had finally managed to scrape together enough discretionary funds from his office's budget to hire independent verification of the police evidence. It was a long shot. Most public defenders didn't have the resources to challenge scent evidence. Most juries believed in police dogs the way they believed in gravity. But Vincent was thorough, and he decided to start by reviewing the surveillance footage from Riverside Park. The park had 3 cameras, one in the parking lot, one near the playground, one near the water fountain. They were old cameras, the kind that recorded to tape that got recycled weekly. But one of the tapes, by luck or providence, had been stored improperly and never recycled. The parking lot camera footage from September 14th, the morning of the robbery, had been preserved. Vincent watched it on his old desktop computer, the video quality grainy but discernible, as Officer Kessler's patrol car pulled into the parking lot at 5:47 a.m. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner of the frame. Kessler was alone in the car except for Barron. The officer got out, walked Barron around the perimeter of the park, and then did something unusual. He opened the back door of his patrol car and pulled out a duffel bag. From the duffel bag, he withdrew a man's shirt and a pair of jeans. He held them up for Barron to sniff, then tossed them on the ground in a designated area of the park. This was normal. This was the training exercise. But then Kessler checked his watch, looked around the empty parking lot, and pulled out his cell phone. Vincent couldn't hear the conversation from the surveillance footage, but he could see Kessler's lips moving, animated, stressed, making gestures like a man arguing with someone over the phone. 26 minutes later, Kessler and Barron left the park. The robbery happened at 7:45 a.m., 2 blocks away. Vincent's hands were shaking as he called Tom Richardson. "You need to see this," Vincent said. "Right now, I'm emailing you the footage. And Tom, there's something else. I pulled the records on Kessler's patrol schedule. He wasn't supposed to be working that morning. He was supposed to be off duty, but he clocked in at 4 a.m., emergency assignment, no paperwork explaining why." In the prosecutor's office, Janet Holloway was experiencing her own educational crisis. She'd assigned one of her junior prosecutors, a young woman named Sarah Delaney, to help with the recess investigation. Sarah had started by pulling Kessler's background file, The kind of routine check that should have been done at the beginning of the case but had somehow been skipped. What she found made her supervisor need to sit down. Officer David Kessler was drowning in debt. His divorce papers, filed 6 months before the robbery, showed that his ex-wife was demanding custody and full support of their 2 children. Kessler's salary was being garnished. He owed $73,000 in back child support. His credit cards were maxed out. His home was in pre-foreclosure. 6 months before the robbery, Kessler had taken out a loan, not from a bank, from a man named Vincent Caruso. The name meant nothing to Sarah initially, but when she ran it through the system, her stomach dropped. Vincent Caruso was connected to organized crime. Not convicted, Caruso was too careful for that, but investigated, suspected, known by every law enforcement agency in the city as a man who moved money in dark places for dark purposes. Sarah pulled the financial records. The loan was for $50,000. The terms were not written down anywhere official, but the implication was clear. Caruso didn't loan money without expecting interest. And Caruso didn't loan money to desperate cops without expecting them to do something in return. She walked into Holloway's office without knocking, her face pale. "We have a problem," Sarah said. "A bigger problem than scent contamination." Back at the courthouse, Judge Morrison had called an emergency meeting with the police commissioner, the district attorney, and the defense attorney. It was closed door, no recording, no official record. "I'm ordering a complete investigation," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "I want to know everything, and I want to know now. How long has Officer Kessler been conducting training exercises at Riverside Park? How many volunteers participated? And most importantly, how many of those volunteers have been defendants in cases where Barron provided evidence?" The police commissioner looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 3 hours. "Your Honor, I can assure you that any training exercises conducted by our officers are done with the utmost professionalism." "Answer the question," Judge Morrison interrupted, "or I'll have you held in contempt." The commissioner made a phone call, then another. Then he received information that made his face go ashen. "At least 3, he finally said. "Possibly more. We're still reviewing the records." "At least 3 innocent people, possibly more." In his jail cell, Marcus Webb received the news that his trial had been suspended pending investigation. Tom Richardson came to see him in person, which meant it was either very good news or very bad news. "It's good," Tom said, and for the first time since his arrest, Marcus saw genuine hope in his attorney's eyes. "Better than good. I think we might be able to get you out." Marcus didn't allow himself to believe it yet. He'd learned that hope was a dangerous thing in the criminal justice system. Hope could break you worse than despair ever could. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Your daughter," Tom said. She remembered seeing Officer Kessler and Barron at Riverside Park. That means Barron's scent evidence is contaminated. The training exercises happened at the same location where your scent would have naturally transferred to the dog, which means the police can't prove you were at the crime scene based on Barron's identification. Marcus's hand went to his chest, as if he could physically hold his heart in place to keep it from exploding out of his body. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say it out loud. "We're getting you released," Tom said, "pending further investigation. But Marcus, the police department is in chaos right now. They're finding problems everywhere they look. This goes deeper than one dog and one contaminated case." That night, as news began to leak out through courthouse contacts and police department sources, the story hit the local news. Not the full story. Nobody outside the investigation knew the full story yet, but enough to spark questions. A 4-year-old girl's innocent observation had triggered an investigation that was beginning to reveal cracks in the entire system. In his apartment, Officer Kessler sat in the dark and waited for the phone calls he knew were coming. He'd made a mistake, a small one, just bringing Barron to the park that morning without authorization. Just a moment of panic when he'd called someone about money he owed. He didn't know yet that the money was connected to organized crime. He didn't know that the robbery was going to happen. He didn't know that his dog would become the perfect tool for framing an innocent man. But as the evening progressed and news alerts began appearing on his phone, as he saw the first mentions of the investigation online, Officer Kessler began to understand that he wasn't just facing a disciplinary hearing or a lawsuit. He was facing something far worse: the complete and total destruction of his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. And it had all started because he'd followed orders from a man he owed money to, a man named Vincent Caruso, a man whose influence reached into places Officer Kessler was only now beginning to understand. The unraveling had begun, and there was no way to stop it. Only forward, only deeper into the darkness. The interrogation room at the police station smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. Officer David Kessler sat across from Detective Sarah Chen, his hands flat on the metal table in front of him. No lawyer. He'd waived his right to legal representation, which meant he was either stupid or he'd already decided his life was over and nothing mattered anymore. Sarah had been a detective for 8 years, and she'd learned to read guilt the way some people read books. It was written all over Kessler's face, not just the guilt of framing one innocent man, but something deeper. The kind of guilt that came from understanding you were part of something monstrous. "Tell me about the loan," Sarah said quietly, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed a bank transfer dated 6 months before the robbery, $50,000, from an account registered to a shell corporation, to an account in Officer Kessler's name. Kessler's jaw clenched. He looked at the photograph like it was a live snake. "I needed money," he said finally. His voice was hollow, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed this confession 1,000 times in his own mind. "My ex-wife was taking me to court. She wanted full custody. The child support was going to bankrupt me. I was losing my house." "So you borrowed from Vincent Caruso," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't know who he was at first," Kessler said. "I just knew he was someone who loaned money. A friend of a friend gave me his number. I called. We met. He said he'd loan me $50,000. I'd pay him back $15,000 over 3 months." Sarah did the math. $15,000 on a $50,000 loan. That was 30% interest per month. That was predatory lending at its most basic. That was the kind of arrangement that trapped people. "And when you couldn't pay?" Sarah asked. Kessler was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. He said there was another way. He said if I did him a favor, the debt would be forgiven. "What kind of favor?" Kessler's hands began to shake. He pulled them off the table and put them in his lap, trying to hide the tremor. "There was a man," Kessler said. "Al Romero. He owned a liquor store. Caruso said this man had witnessed something he shouldn't have witnessed, a business deal. Caruso said the situation needed to be handled delicately. He said if I could arrange for the store to be robbed, make it look random, it would serve 2 purposes. First, Romero would understand that Caruso was serious, that he was vulnerable, that he needed to keep his mouth shut about what he'd seen. Second, it would give Caruso an opportunity to send a message to people who worked for him, who might be thinking of crossing him." Sarah felt her stomach turn. This wasn't just corruption. This was organized crime using the police department as an instrument of intimidation. "Who robbed the store?" Sarah asked. "That's the thing," Kessler said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now, like he wanted to explain himself, wanted someone to understand that he hadn't meant for it to go this far. "Caruso had someone do it, someone not connected to the department. I was just supposed to provide cover. I was supposed to make sure the investigation went in the wrong direction." "By planting evidence," Sarah said. "By using Barron," Kessler corrected. Caruso knew that I'd been conducting training exercises at Riverside Park. Caruso knows everything. He has information on everything. He knew about the volunteers. He knew about Marcus Webb. He said to make sure Barron tracked to Webb's scent. He said to be confident about it. He said juries believe dogs more than they believe anything else. Sarah leaned back in her chair, trying to process the scope of what Kessler was telling her. This wasn't a cop who'd gone rogue. This wasn't a one-off corruption incident. This was a criminal organization using the police department as a tool. This was organized crime with a badge. "How many people know about this?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Kessler said. "That's the terrifying part. I don't know who else Caruso owns. I don't know how deep it goes. He talks about officers in the department like they're all on his payroll, but he never gives me names. He says it's better if I don't know, less dangerous that way." Sarah made a note. Less dangerous for Kessler, more dangerous for the investigation. Caruso was smart. He compartmentalized. Each corrupted officer only knew about their own arrangement, their own debt, their own favor. That way, if one person was arrested, they couldn't take down the entire network. "And Marcus Webb?" Sarah asked. "An innocent man spent 3 months in jail because of you." For the first time since the interrogation began, Kessler showed genuine emotion. His eyes filled with tears. Not tears of remorse necessarily, but tears of someone confronting the reality of what he'd done. "I didn't know," he said. "When Caruso told me to make sure Barron tracked to Webb, I thought Webb must have actually been there. I thought maybe my memory was wrong about the training exercises. I thought maybe Webb was guilty and I was just helping the system work correctly. I told myself that." "But you didn't believe that," Sarah said. "No," Kessler admitted. "Deep down, I knew. I knew Webb's timeline didn't work. I knew the security footage from his workplace cleared him. But I had a choice. I could believe my own dog's testimony, trust in Barron's infallibility, and tell myself that everything was fine. Or I could admit that I'd knowingly participated in framing an innocent man. And if I admitted that, my life was over." He looked up at Sarah with eyes that held nothing but resignation. "So I chose to lie," he said. "I lied to myself. I lied to the court. I lied to the jury. I told myself it was easier than facing the truth." Back in the prosecutor's office, Janet Holloway was going through her own crisis of conscience. She'd built her entire career on the assumption that the system worked. That if she presented the evidence, if she made the case, if she trusted the cops and the dogs and the forensic science, then justice would prevail. But what if the system itself was corrupted? What if the cops she trusted were liars? What if the dogs were tools of manipulation? Sarah Delaney, the junior prosecutor who discovered Kessler's financial connections to Caruso, sat across from her supervisor with a laptop showing financial records. "There's more," Sarah was saying. "Kessler's not the only one. Look at these patrol officers. Look at their bank accounts. Some of them have received regular deposits that don't match their salary. Some have paid off debts suspiciously quickly. Some own property that shouldn't be affordable on a cop's salary." Holloway felt the weight of institutional corruption settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd prosecuted Marcus Webb in good faith. She'd believed the evidence was solid. She'd believed in the system. And the system had failed. Worse than failed, it had been weaponized. "We need to notify the judge immediately," Holloway said. "And we need to open the Webb case. We need to declare a mistrial. We need to." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to articulate the magnitude of what they needed to do. "We need to review every case Kessler ever worked on," Sarah finished for her. "Every conviction where he provided evidence, every case where Barron was used. We need to assume they might all be corrupted." In the FBI field office downtown, Agent Michael Torres was coordinating with multiple agencies. The FBI had been investigating Vincent Caruso for 3 years, building a case so carefully that they'd almost lost sight of it. but Kessler's confession had opened a door they'd been trying to crack. If Caruso was using the police department as a tool, then the FBI's entire approach needed to change. They weren't just looking for a criminal organization anymore. They were looking for systemic corruption that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. Torres called his supervisor and laid out what they'd discovered. Caruso has placed officers at various levels of the department, Torres was saying. Patrol, narcotics, organized crime task force. They're receiving regular payments in exchange for specific services, burying cases, planting evidence, warning dealers about raids. How many? His supervisor asked. We don't know yet. That's the problem. Kessler was compromised 6 months ago, but Caruso's been operating in this city for at least 15 years. How many other officers has he turned in that time? The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with implication. In his cell, Officer Kessler waited for the next interrogation, the next conversation, the next moment of reckoning. He'd confessed to framing an innocent man. He'd admitted to being part of an organized crime scheme. He'd given up Caruso's name, his methods, his general approach. But he knew he'd only scratched the surface. Caruso was smart. Caruso was careful, and Caruso had contingencies. That's what terrified Kessler the most. He'd betrayed Caruso by talking, and Caruso was not a man who tolerated betrayal. There was a detective stationed outside his cell. Protection officially, but Kessler understood the subtext. He was valuable now, but he was also dangerous. If Caruso got to him, if Caruso silenced him permanently, then the investigation would lose its primary witness. So Kessler sat in his cell and waited, knowing that his life had two possible endings. Either he'd spend the next 20 years in prison for his crimes, or Caruso would ensure he didn't see his next birthday. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. But what Kessler didn't know, what nobody outside the FBI's investigation knew, was that Caruso had already decided how to handle the situation. Vincent Caruso sat in his office overlooking the city, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, and made a single phone call to a man he'd been paying for years. A man in the police department. A man in a position of significant authority. We have a problem, Caruso said quietly. Officer Kessler is becoming a liability, and I need you to understand something very clearly. If this investigation reaches a certain point, if certain names start getting mentioned, if certain relationships come to light, then we all go down together. All of us. No exceptions. He paused, letting that sink in. So I'm going to need you to do something for me, Caruso continued. I'm going to need you to bury this. Bury it deep. Make it go away. Because if you don't, I'm going to have a very long conversation with the FBI about all the things I know about you. And in that moment, the conspiracy that had started with a desperate cop and a desperate loan spread to someone in a position to actually control the investigation. The corruption wasn't just at the street level. It reached upward. It reached into positions of authority. And now, as Kessler's confession was being processed and documented, someone with the power to influence the investigation was being given a choice: cooperate with Caruso or be destroyed by him. The machinery of corruption had just activated its insurance policy. The federal building downtown was operating on a different timeline now. Normal business hours had been suspended. It was 4:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning when Agent Michael Torres coordinated the final briefing before moving on Vincent Caruso. Every agent in the organized crime task force was present. Every piece of evidence had been checked and rechecked. Every contingency had been planned for. Torres stood in front of a wall displaying Caruso's photograph. A man in his 50s with silver hair, expensive taste in suits, and the kind of cold eyes that suggested he'd made peace with the darkness inside himself long ago. "We move at dawn," Torres was saying, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. "The target is at his office in the financial district. He always arrives by 6 a.m. We have unmarked vehicles positioned at every exit. We have forensic teams ready to secure his computers and financial records. We have 24 agents ready for simultaneous arrests at 6 additional locations. He paused, letting his eyes move across the assembled law enforcement. This organization is larger and more entrenched than we initially believed. What started as a drug distribution investigation has expanded into evidence tampering, witness intimidation, money laundering, and the corruption of multiple police officers. What started with the framing of one innocent man has revealed a network that reaches into every level of this city's law enforcement. One of the younger agents raised his hand. What about the officer in the police department? The one Caruso was calling. We still don't know who he is. Tor's jaw tightened. This was the part that terrified him. Somewhere in the police department, someone was compromised. Someone in a position of authority. And until they identified that person, the investigation itself was at risk of being sabotaged from within. We're keeping that information compartmentalized, Tor said. Only 3 people know about that phone call: me, the director, and the assistant U.S. attorney. We're not discussing it with the police department until we have confirmation of who we're dealing with. Understood? The agents nodded. They understood the implication. Trust your colleagues, but not too much. Assume corruption until proven otherwise. This was what Caruso's operation did to institutions. It infected them with paranoia. By 6:23 a.m., Vincent Caruso was being led from his office building in handcuffs. He didn't resist. Men who'd operated at Caruso's level understood the game. Sometimes you won, sometimes you lost, and when you lost, you accepted it with dignity and started planning your defense. The perp walk was magnificent from a media standpoint. Caruso, still composed, still dignified, surrounded by federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI. The photographers captured it perfectly. The kingpin finally brought down, his empire crumbling, his reign of terror ending. But in the car on the way to federal detention, Caruso smiled. He knew something the FBI didn't know yet. He had insurance. He had people. And by the time they finished processing him, by the time they read him his rights, by the time his lawyer arrived, certain things would already be in motion. Back at the courthouse, Marcus Webb sat in a courtroom that looked completely different now. The confidence that had filled the prosecution's side of the room was gone. In its place was chaos, multiple attorneys conferring with each other, Judge Morrison reviewing amended filings, Tom Richardson looking like a man who'd won the lottery but hadn't yet let himself celebrate. "The charges are being dropped," Judge Morrison announced, and those 5 words seemed to reverberate through the courtroom like a bell tolling the end of something. "All charges against Marcus Webb are hereby dismissed. The defendant is free to go." Marcus didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply nodded, unable to trust his voice, unable to articulate the magnitude of what it meant to have his life returned to him. Alina screamed from the gallery. Not a scream of fear or pain, but a scream of pure relief, the kind of vocalization that happens when a pressure that's been building for months suddenly releases. Sophia, not fully understanding what was happening, simply hugged her mother, happy because her mother was happy. What followed was a media explosion. The story was too good, too perfectly constructed, too full of emotional resonance for the press to resist. A man falsely accused, a criminal conspiracy, organized crime infiltrating law enforcement, and at the center of it all, a 4-year-old girl who'd remembered seeing a dog at the park. The networks ran the photograph over and over, Sophia in her pink dress, sitting in the courtroom, coloring while her father's life hung in the balance. The image became iconic. It represented innocence. It represented the fragility of justice. It represented the miracle of chance. Sophia Webb trended on Twitter within hours. By noon, 3 major news networks had requested interviews with Sophia and Alina. By evening, A book deal was being negotiated. By the next morning, a documentary production company had reached out with a proposal. Alina sat in her living room, holding her daughter, while her phone buzzed endlessly with interview requests, appearance requests, sponsorship offers. Everyone wanted a piece of the girl who'd saved an innocent man. Sophia, meanwhile, was more interested in coloring. She had no idea that she'd become famous. She had no concept of social media or hashtags or trending topics. She was just a little girl who'd noticed something about a dog, who'd mentioned it in a courtroom, and who'd accidentally changed the course of multiple people's lives. In the police headquarters, the atmosphere had transformed into something resembling a funeral. The police commissioner held a press conference where he looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. "We have failed this community," he said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional shame. "We are implementing a comprehensive review of all cases involving the officers currently under investigation. Anyone who believes they may have been wrongly convicted is urged to contact the public defender's office." Within 48 hours, 12 people came forward. 12 individuals who'd been convicted, at least partially, based on evidence provided by Officer Kessler or other compromised officers. 12 potential victims of the same system that had almost destroyed Marcus Webb. A special task force was created to review their cases. Law students from the university volunteered their time. The public defender's office, suddenly flush with resources and public support, began the meticulous work of reviewing every conviction, every piece of evidence, every connection to the corruption network. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. 7 of the 12 individuals were likely innocent. Another 3 had cases so compromised by corrupted evidence that new trials would be necessary. Only 2 had evidence that seemed to hold up under scrutiny, and even those cases were tainted by the association with the broader corruption. The criminal justice system in the city had been fundamentally broken. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation was expanding exponentially. Every financial record connected to Caruso was being examined. Every officer whose bank account showed suspicious deposits was being questioned. Every case where evidence had been planted was being reviewed. Agent Torres was working 18-hour days, coordinating across multiple agencies, trying to map the full scope of corruption. What emerged was a network that reached higher than anyone had expected. It wasn't just patrol officers and narcotics detectives. It was sergeants. It was captains. It was a lieutenant in the Organized Crime Task Force, the very task force that was supposed to be investigating Caruso. By the end of the first week of investigation, 17 police officers had been arrested. By the end of the second week, that number had grown to 23. The police department was hemorrhaging credibility. In federal detention, Vincent Caruso sat in an interrogation room with his lawyer, a man named Gerald Finch who defended white-collar criminals for 30 years and had the kind of calm demeanor that suggested nothing could rattle him. "I'm prepared to discuss the terms of a plea agreement," Finch told Torres, sliding across a document that had clearly been prepared in advance. Caruso had known he was going to be arrested. He'd prepared for it, and now he was prepared to negotiate. "My client is willing to cooperate fully with the investigation into police corruption," Finch continued. "In exchange, we request consideration on sentencing recommendations. My client has extensive information about which officers are on his payroll, how long they've been compromised, and which cases have been affected by their cooperation." Torres felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. Caruso was going to cooperate. Caruso was going to give up his network. This wasn't a surprise. Career criminals often cooperated when facing federal time. But the scope of what Caruso could tell them, the depth of information he possessed, was going to make this investigation exponentially larger and more dangerous for the people involved. In the interrogation room, Caruso leaned forward and smiled at Torres. "I'm going to tell you everything," Caruso said. "Names, dates, amounts, methods, all of it. But I want you to understand something, Agent Torres. This corruption goes deeper than the police department. The money doesn't just disappear into officers' pockets. It gets funneled through shell corporations, through private security firms, through legitimate businesses. Someone very high up is facilitating this. Someone with access to resources and connections that go beyond the police department." Torres felt his stomach tighten. "Who?" he asked. Caruso smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd spent his entire life playing a game that most people didn't even know existed. "That," Caruso said, "is going to take some time to explain." And as Caruso began to lay out a conspiracy that reached far beyond the police department, one that involved politicians, judges, and city officials, Torres realized that Marcus Webb's wrongful conviction had been just the tip of an iceberg. The system that had almost destroyed an innocent man wasn't broken by accident. It had been deliberately corrupted by people in positions of power, people who'd been protecting their own interests for years. And the work of untangling that corruption, of exposing the network, of bringing down everyone involved, was going to be far more dangerous and far more costly than anyone had imagined. Detective Sarah Chen received the message on her personal phone at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, exactly 1 week after Caruso's arrest. She was sitting on her apartment couch, reviewing case files by lamplight, her laptop open to financial records that seemed to multiply and branch with every new discovery. The text message came from an unknown number. "Stop digging. There are things bigger than you." She stared at it for 15 seconds without moving. In her 8 years as a detective, she'd received threats before. They came with the job, but this one felt different. This one felt personal. This one felt like someone who knew exactly what she was working on. She called her supervisor immediately, her voice steady despite the chill that had settled in her chest. "I received a threat," she said, "on my personal phone from an unknown number." The supervisor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Forward me the message. We're assigning you a protection detail, effective immediately. Pack a bag." By the time Sarah hung up, she could hear the weight of institutional concern in his voice. This wasn't routine. This was someone inside the investigation taking the threat seriously enough to deploy resources before they'd even finished reviewing the message. Within hours, Sarah had 2 FBI agents stationed outside her apartment. Plainclothes operatives who'd been trained to blend in, to watch, to protect. They introduced themselves as Marcus and Diana, and they came equipped with the kind of professional competence that suggested they'd done this 100 times before. But Sarah had never experienced protective custody before. It made her feel vulnerable in ways that surprised her. It made her feel like prey. "We think you're in danger because you're closer to something sensitive than you realize," Diana explained as they prepared Sarah's apartment for the agent's arrival. "The threat came after you started cross-referencing patrol schedules with financial records. You were starting to identify patterns that could lead to someone in a position of authority." "Who?" Sarah asked. "We don't know yet," Diana said. "That's what makes this dangerous. Caruso has cooperated extensively, but he's being deliberately vague about certain relationships. He's given up street-level officers and mid-level management, but when we ask about the highest-level corrupted official, he claims he doesn't want to incriminate himself further by discussing complicated matters of mutual interest." Sarah understood the implication. Caruso had dirt on someone powerful, someone with the ability to make problems disappear, someone with access to resources and influence that reached beyond the police department. And Sarah's investigation was getting close to identifying that person. Meanwhile, in the interrogation rooms of the federal building, Caruso was conducting a masterclass in negotiation. He had a lawyer, multiple lawyers actually, coordinating his testimony with the precision of someone who understood that information was the most valuable currency in the criminal justice system. Agent Torres sat across from him, trying to navigate the minefield of Caruso's partial cooperation. Every answer was calculated. Every piece of information came with strings attached. Caruso was giving them enough to prosecute his lower-level associates, but when it came to the highest-level corrupted official, he became vague. "I'm concerned about my safety," Caruso explained, his voice carrying the tone of a reasonable businessman discussing quarterly earnings. "If I name names at the top level, there are people who'd have strong incentives to ensure I don't live long enough to testify at trial. So I'm going to need certain assurances before I provide that information." Torres felt his frustration mounting. They had Caruso. They had the evidence. But Caruso still had leverage, and he wasn't going to give it up easily. "What kind of assurances?" Torres asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "Witness protection," Caruso said. "Federal relocation. A new identity. A new life somewhere far from here. And before you say that's standard for cooperating witnesses in federal cases, understand this. I'm not talking about the mob or drug dealers or street-level criminals. I'm talking about someone who has the resources of an entire city government at their disposal. I'm talking about someone who's already shown they're willing to have people killed to protect their interests." Torres' blood went cold. Not killed in the sense of street violence or organized crime assassination. Killed in the sense of people dying in accidents, in prison, in ways that looked natural or coincidental. The kind of killing that only happened when someone had the power to make problems disappear. Back at police headquarters, Captain Robert Harrison was sitting in his office with a newspaper spread across his desk. The headlines screamed about police corruption, about Caruso's network, about the 17 officers already arrested. Harrison had been a decorated officer for 23 years. He had commendations. He had photographs hanging in the hallway showing him receiving awards from the mayor. He had a pension that was secure. He had a life that, until recently, had seemed completely stable. Then Caruso had brought him into the fold 15 years ago. It had started simply. A favor, just a small one. Someone needed information about a case. Someone needed a warning before a raid. Someone needed evidence buried. One small favor had led to another small favor, and before Harrison understood what was happening, he was enmeshed in a criminal organization. He told himself it was manageable. He told himself that as long as nobody found out, it didn't matter. He told himself that the money, substantial, regular payments that had allowed him to send his daughters to private schools and buy a house in the good neighborhood, was worth the compromise. Then Kessler had been arrested. Then Kessler had confessed. Then the entire network had begun to unravel. And now Harrison was waiting for the knock on his door that would end his life as he knew it. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Captain Harrison," a voice he didn't recognize. "This is a courtesy call. You need to understand that your arrest is imminent. The federal investigation has you identified as the high-level corrupted officer in the police department. They'll be coming for you within 48 hours. Harrison's hand went numb. "Who is this?" he asked, but he already knew the answer. "Someone who still has friends in the department," the voice said. "Someone who wanted to give you a chance to prepare, to understand what's coming, and to understand that if you cooperate with the FBI, if you give them any information about your relationship with Vincent Caruso, there will be consequences, not for you necessarily, but for your family." The line went dead. Sarah Chen's protection detail was upgraded within hours. More agents, safer locations, a motel room in a different city. By Friday afternoon, she was living in a safe house 40 miles outside the city, in a small town near the state border, with a 2-person FBI security detail and a new understanding of how vulnerable she actually was. She spent her days looking out windows at a landscape she didn't recognize, waiting for phone calls that updated her on the investigation, living a life that felt like being underwater. Everything was muffled. Everything was distant. Everything was separated from her by the weight of protective custody. Diana, her primary protection agent, sat with her while she ate meals she didn't taste, while she reviewed case files that seemed to be multiplying faster than she could process them. "We found something," Diana told her on Saturday morning. "In the encrypted communications between Captain Harrison and Vincent Caruso. They've been in contact for 15 years, but in the past week, there's been a significant change in their communications. Harrison is asking about you specifically, about your investigation, about what you've discovered." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "He knows I'm getting close to something," Sarah said. "He's trying to figure out what." "We think he's trying to figure out if you've discovered his identity," Diana corrected. "Right now, the investigation is moving forward on multiple fronts. We're reviewing financial records. We're interviewing officers. We're building a case. But we don't have definitive proof connecting Harrison to Caruso yet. That's what you were working on. That's why you're in danger." Monday morning, Captain Robert Harrison was arrested at his home. He didn't resist. He went quietly, with the kind of resignation that comes from understanding you've been caught with no way out. The news coverage was intense. A captain, a decorated officer, a man in a position of significant authority, all of it corrupted, all of it exposed. But in the safe house, Sarah Chen received a phone call from Tors with information that made her blood run cold. "We found something in Harrison's encrypted communications," Tors said. "Someone in the department tipped him off about the arrest. Someone told him it was coming. And more concerning, someone warned him against cooperating with us. Someone threatened his family." "Who?" Sarah asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "We don't know yet," Tors said. "That's why I'm telling you the threat against you is real, and it's not coming from Caruso, it's coming from someone else. Someone still inside the police department, someone who knows about your investigation, someone who has the ability to reach you." Sarah stood at the window of the safe house, looking out at a parking lot she didn't recognize, understanding the implications of what Tors was telling her. The investigation hadn't exposed the corruption. The investigation had revealed that the corruption was deeper, more systemic, more entrenched than anyone had realized. And now there was someone inside the police department itself, someone with authority, someone with access, someone with the ability to influence the investigation, who was actively working to obstruct it. Which meant that Sarah wasn't just in danger from an external criminal organization. She was in danger from the system she'd sworn to serve. The system that had hired her, trained her, trusted her to investigate corruption, while all the while protecting that corruption at the highest levels. And as she stood in that safe house, under protection from federal agents, waiting for the next discovery that would pull the thread further, Sarah understood that the fight for justice had just entered a new phase. A phase where she couldn't trust her own agency. A phase where the enemy didn't wear obvious colors. A phase where the real battle would be fought in the shadows, by people willing to destroy their own careers, their own lives, to expose the truth. The name in the encrypted files was Lieutenant James Sullivan. Sarah's hands were shaking as she held the printout, reading through the email chain for the third time, hoping that somehow the words would rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. But they didn't. The message was clear, unmistakable, devastating. "Sullivan will bury anything that gets too close. He owes me from the Miami operation." Sullivan, her partner, the man she'd worked with for 5 years, the man who'd been standing beside her every single step of the way during the investigation into Kessler's corruption. She was in the safe house when Tors brought her the files. Diana, her protection agent, sat in the corner of the room, pretending not to watch Sarah's face as her world collapsed. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "We're sure," Torres said quietly. He was a good man, Sarah thought. He was delivering devastating news with as much compassion as the situation allowed. Sullivan has received regular deposits from shell corporations connected to Caruso for the past 7 years. He's also the one who warned Harrison about the impending arrest. We have phone records. We have timestamps. We have his cell tower data placing him at specific locations when specific warnings were being delivered. 7 years. 7 years of partnership. 7 years of trusting someone who'd been selling her out the entire time. Sarah stood and walked to the window of the safe house. Outside, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon was happening in the world. Cars passing, people going about their lives, none of them understanding the machinery of corruption that operated beneath the surface of their reality. "Why?" she asked. "Why would he do it? Sullivan comes from money. He doesn't need Caruso's money. His wife's family is wealthy. His pension is secure. Why would he compromise himself?" "Miami operation," Torres said. "That's what Caruso mentioned in the email. We're still trying to figure out what that refers to, but preliminary investigation suggests Sullivan may have been involved in something there. Something bad. Something that Caruso has leverage over." Sarah closed her eyes. She could see Sullivan's face in her mind. Sullivan laughing at their desks. Sullivan buying her coffee when she was working late. Sullivan being the kind of partner who had her back. Or so she'd thought. When they brought Sullivan in for questioning, Sarah watched from behind one-way glass as her former partner took a seat in the interrogation room. He was wearing a suit. He'd dressed well for his arrest, which suggested he'd known it was coming. Torres began with the evidence. The financial records, the phone calls to Harrison, the emails from Caruso discussing how Sullivan would bury anything that gets too close. Sullivan's composure held for the first 20 minutes, then it cracked. "You don't understand," Sullivan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't understand what happened in Miami. You don't understand what I did there." "Tell us," Torres said quietly. Sullivan's hands began to shake. Behind the glass, Sarah watched her partner, her friend, begin to fall apart. "There was a raid," Sullivan said. "A drug operation. Intel suggested there was 30 kilos of cocaine in a warehouse. We went in hard, but the intel was wrong. The warehouse was empty. We tore the place apart looking for the drugs, and we found something else." He paused, struggling to continue. "We found a family that wasn't supposed to be there. They lived in the back of the warehouse. Nobody knew they were there. It was accident. It was just fucking bad luck and bad intel." Sarah felt something twist in her stomach. "What happened?" Torres asked. "During the raid," Sullivan said, his voice barely a whisper, "there was gunfire. We thought there were hostiles. Turns out there were just scared people defending themselves. One of them was a child. A kid couldn't have been more than 7 years old." Sullivan's hands covered his face. "The child was killed," he said, "by a member of our team, and we covered it up. We reported that the raid was on an empty location. We said there was no resistance. We said nobody was there. And then we all agreed to keep quiet about what actually happened." Torres didn't move. Sarah didn't move. The revelation hung in the air between them like a physical weight. "How does Caruso fit into this?" Torres asked. "Caruso has connections in Miami," Sullivan said. "He found out what happened. He contacted me and said he had evidence. Video footage from a witness. Photographs. Enough to destroy my career, enough to get me prosecuted for conspiracy to commit murder cover-up, enough to send me to federal prison." Sullivan looked up at Torres, and his eyes were hollow. "He said he'd keep quiet if I helped him with certain things, if I buried cases, if I warned people about raids, if I made sure certain investigations went nowhere. And I did it. I did all of it. Because the alternative was losing my family, losing my freedom, being known as the guy who covered up the murder of a child." Behind the glass, Sarah felt like she might be sick. Sullivan had compromised himself for years because of something he'd done in Miami, because of a child who died, because he was trying to protect his family from the consequences of his own moral failure. And he'd done it by participating in the very system that had almost destroyed an innocent man, by helping to frame Marcus Webb, by protecting Officer Kessler, by working directly against Sarah's investigation. "Did you know Marcus Webb was innocent?" Sarah asked, speaking for the first time into the audio feed. Sullivan flinched at the sound of her voice. He knew she was listening. He turned and looked directly at the glass, directly at her, even though he couldn't see her. "Yes," he said simply, "I knew. When Kessler brought the case to me, when he explained what he'd done, I knew Webb was innocent. But I also knew that if I reported it, if I told the truth, Caruso would destroy me. He'd release the Miami evidence. He'd destroy my family. And I chose myself. I chose my own survival over an innocent man's freedom." The interrogation room was silent, except for the sound of Sullivan's breathing. "I've been lying for 7 years," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying the weight of that realization. "I've been helping a criminal organization operate inside the police department. I've been protecting officers who were committing crimes. I've been burying cases. I've been blackmailing people. I've been everything I swore I'd never be." He looked directly at the glass again. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You trusted me. You worked beside me every single day. And I was using you. I was using your investigation to find out what Caruso wanted to know. I was reporting back to him about what you discovered. I was trying to stop you from getting too close to the truth." When Sarah walked out of the observation room, she felt like she was moving through water. Diana followed her, giving her space but staying close enough to catch her if she fell. "I worked with him," Sarah said to nobody in particular. "Every day for 5 years. I trusted him with my life." "He was also trusting you with his life," Diana said quietly. "He was trusting that you wouldn't discover what he'd done. He was trusting that Caruso's threat was sufficient to keep him in line." "That doesn't make it better," Sarah said. "No," Diana agreed. "It doesn't, but it makes it human. Sullivan made a choice, a bad choice, a choice that hurt innocent people. But it was a human choice made by someone who was terrified and desperate and corrupted by circumstances beyond his control." They walked in silence for a moment. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Sullivan cooperates fully with the investigation," Torres said, appearing from another corridor. "He gives us names. He gives us the Miami operation details. He explains his entire relationship with Caruso and how the corruption within the police department operated." "And in return?" Sarah asked. "In return," Torres said, "he faces federal charges, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering. He'll likely spend 10 to 15 years in prison. His career is over. His pension is probably gone. His family will know what he did." Sarah looked at Torres. "Is that justice?" Torres didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was heavy with the weight of the question. "Justice is complicated," he said finally. "Sullivan broke the law. He hurt people. He corrupted the system he was supposed to protect. All of that deserves punishment. But he's also a human being who made bad choices for understandable reasons, and those reasons matter too. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. And sometimes understanding the explanation is part of what justice requires." That night in the safe house, Sarah sat alone and watched the news coverage of Sullivan's arrest. The headlines screamed about police corruption reaching into higher ranks. They showed photographs of Sullivan in his uniform, decorated and respected, all that authority and trust now revealed as a facade. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about the 12 other innocent people whose cases had been compromised by officers like Sullivan and Kessler. She thought about the integrity of the entire system. And she thought about the choice that Sullivan had made, the choice to protect himself over innocent people, the choice that had seemed necessary at the time but had cost so much. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began writing her statement, not for the FBI necessarily, but for herself, a record of what had happened, a documentation of how a system designed to protect the innocent had been corrupted from within by people who'd made understandable but unforgivable choices. As she wrote, she understood that this was the real cost of corruption, not just the wrongful convictions, not just the destroyed lives, but the destruction of trust itself. Sullivan had been her partner, and now he would always be the man who'd betrayed her trust. That was a wound that wouldn't heal, not completely, not ever, because trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. It could only be rebuilt painstakingly with people who'd proven themselves worthy of it. And Sarah would spend the rest of her career, and possibly the rest of her life, learning who those people were. 1 year later, on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, Sarah Chen stood in front of a classroom full of criminal justice students at the state university. She was 34 years old, but she looked older. The weight of the past year had aged her in ways that extended beyond the physical. She'd resigned from the police department 3 months after Sullivan's arrest, not because she'd been forced to, but because she couldn't walk back into that building and feel safe. Couldn't sit at a desk in a room full of colleagues and pretend that she didn't wonder which ones might be compromised. Couldn't work in an institution that had betrayed itself so thoroughly. Instead, she'd taken a job with a federal oversight organization that investigated police misconduct. She traveled from city to city, reviewed cases, testified in hearings, and bore witness to the ways institutions could rot from within. Today's lecture was titled Corruption and Institutional Accountability. She'd been asked to speak about her experiences, to help the next generation of lawyers and police officers understand how corruption operated, how it was maintained, and how it could be fought. The university auditorium was full. 300 students plus faculty, plus several members of the local police department who'd come to hear what Sarah had to say. She could see the skepticism on some of their faces, cops who believed she was being disloyal, who thought she should have protected the department rather than expose its corruption. She didn't care what they thought anymore. Corruption in law enforcement operates through a simple mechanism, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. Someone breaks a law, someone else finds out, and then a choice is made. Either report the crime and accept the consequences, or protect the criminal and pay a price in moral compromise. She clicked to the first slide, which showed Officer Kessler's photograph. Officer David Kessler made that choice. He was desperate for money. A criminal organization offered him a loan, and when he couldn't pay it back, they offered him a way out. He'd plant false evidence. He'd frame an innocent man. In return, his debt would be forgiven. The auditorium was silent. Officer Kessler wasn't a particularly bad person, Sarah continued. He was a desperate person, a person in financial crisis, a person who saw a way to solve his immediate problems without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. She clicked to the next slide, Marcus Webb's photograph. But Marcus Webb suffered for Kessler's desperation. Marcus spent 3 months in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Marcus nearly lost his daughter. Marcus nearly lost his entire life because one officer made a choice to prioritize his own survival over the integrity of the system. Sarah paused, letting that sink in. And then Lieutenant James Sullivan made a similar choice. Sullivan had made a terrible mistake in Miami. He'd participated in covering up the killing of a child. A criminal organization discovered this and used it as leverage. Sullivan could either expose himself or he could help them. He chose to help them. She clicked to Sullivan's photograph. Sullivan was corrupted not by his own crime but by his fear of facing the consequences of his crime. And in protecting himself, he hurt people. He actively participated in framing an innocent man. He worked to obstruct an investigation. He betrayed his partner and his oath. In the back of the auditorium, Marcus Webb sat quietly, listening. He'd become something of a public figure since his exoneration, the innocent man whose daughter had saved him. He'd appeared on talk shows, he'd given interviews. He'd started his foundation, Reasonable Doubt, which had grown exponentially in the past year. 17 wrongful convictions had been overturned. 17 people had been freed because of the investigation into corruption that had started with Sophia's innocent comment about a dog. 17 lives had been partially restored. But restoration was never complete. Marcus still had nightmares about his time in county jail. His daughter still asked sometimes where her daddy had gone when she was 4 years old. Elena had managed to stay with him, but their relationship bore scars from the separation and trauma. He listened to Sarah speak, and he felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Gratitude that someone like Sarah had been willing to pursue the truth, even when it meant betraying her own colleagues. Anger that the system had required her to make that choice. Sorrow for everyone who'd been hurt by corruption. And something else. Something that might have been forgiveness, though he wasn't sure who he was forgiving. The officers who'd hurt him, the system that had failed him, or society that had allowed such corruption to flourish. 6 months earlier, Vincent Caruso had been sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The sentencing hearing had been public, with victims and their families given the opportunity to speak. Marcus had testified. He'd sat in the same courtroom where his trial had nearly ended his life, and he'd told the judge about the cost of Caruso's crimes. The cost in lost time, lost opportunity, lost peace of mind. Caruso, seated at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, had listened without expression. He'd cooperated with the investigation, given up his network, provided information that had led to the prosecution of 27 police officers and 6 city officials. In exchange, he'd received a relatively light sentence for organized crime. Some people had called it a deal, others had called it a betrayal of justice. But Caruso had also filed an appeal. His lawyers, expensive and competent, had argued that he'd been coerced into cooperation, that his confessions had been obtained through improper interrogation, that the evidence against him was circumstantial. The appeal was still ongoing. Caruso might serve his 40 years, or he might be freed on a technicality. The machinery of justice ground on, slowly and inefficiently, with no guarantee of reaching the right conclusion. Officer David Kessler had received a 15-year sentence. He'd been transferred to a federal penitentiary where other inmates knew exactly what he was, a cop who'd framed an innocent man. His life in prison was not pleasant. But he was alive. He was serving his time, and unlike some of the other corrupted officers, he'd accepted his responsibility without fighting it. Lieutenant James Sullivan had received 12 years. He'd cooperated fully, given testimony against Caruso, and helped the investigation expand in directions that might not have been discovered otherwise. But cooperation didn't erase what he'd done. It only reduced the consequences. Captain Robert Harrison had received 20 years. He'd fought his charges vigorously, maintained his innocence, and refused to cooperate with investigators. He was currently appealing his conviction on multiple grounds. Sarah's lecture continued for another 90 minutes. She discussed the patterns of corruption, how it operated through personal leverage, how it was maintained through institutional loyalty and code of silence mentality, how it could only be fought through individuals willing to tell the truth, even when that truth was costly. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, gradually, the students began to applaud. But Sarah knew that applause meant nothing. What mattered was what these students would do when they entered the system themselves, when they faced choices about whether to report corruption or protect their colleagues, when they had to decide between institutional loyalty and actual justice. After the lecture, Marcus found Sarah in her green room. She was collecting her notes, looking tired in a way that suggested she'd given this same speech too many times. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. Sarah looked up, and her face registered recognition and something that might have been complicated sadness. "Marcus," she said, "I'm glad you came. I wanted you to know," Marcus continued, "that what you did mattered, not just for me but for everyone. 17 people, Sarah. 17 innocent people are free because you were willing to pursue the truth." Sarah set down her papers and looked at him directly. "I destroyed people's lives in pursuit of that truth," she said quietly. "Officer Kessler's family lost their father. Sullivan's children know that their father is a criminal. Harrison's wife is facing financial ruin. I did the right thing, but the right thing came at a cost that extends to innocent people who didn't make the choices their relatives made." "That's the paradox of justice," Marcus said. "The right path isn't always the painless path. Sometimes protecting one innocent person requires hurting others, but that's better than the alternative." He paused. "If you'd covered for Sullivan, if you protected Kessler, if you'd done what institutional loyalty demanded, I'd still be in prison, maybe for the rest of my life. 17 other people would still be in prison. The corruption would continue unchecked. So yes, Sullivan's children are hurt by their father's crimes being exposed, but that's on him. That's on the choices he made. You didn't do that to his family. He did." As Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in the green room, surrounded by the physical remnants of her testimony. Photographs, documents, evidence of institutional betrayal and individual courage. She thought about the case that had started it all. A 4-year-old girl commenting on a dog. One innocent observation that had unraveled an entire network of corruption. Sophia Webb was 5 now. She attended kindergarten. She had no memory of the courtroom, no understanding of the massive machinery of justice that had been set in motion by her simple comment. But her father was free. That was what mattered. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened social media. Sophia Webb was no longer trending, but there were occasional posts about the case, about the corruption investigation, about the 17 wrongful convictions that had been overturned. And then, as she was reviewing the news, a notification appeared. Caruso appeal denied. Federal Appellate Court upholds original conviction and sentencing. Sarah felt something release in her chest. It wasn't closure. Closure wasn't possible in cases like this, where too many people had suffered, where too much damage had been done. But it was justice. Imperfect, incomplete, arrived at through a system that was deeply flawed, but justice nonetheless. She thought about the years ahead. More cases to investigate, more corruption to expose, more hard choices to make. The work was never finished. The fight against institutional corruption would continue long after this case faded from public memory. But for now, in this moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system could be reformed. That maybe good people, willing to sacrifice their own security for the truth, could actually change institutions. It was a fragile hope, but it was all she had.